So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for making some time on a Monday afternoon to join us at the Wits Centre for Journalism as we talk to Dr. Richard Stupart. Rich is from the University of Liverpool, a senior lecturer there. Richard has joined us in South Africa for a period of time to do some research, and he's joined us as a British Academy Fellow attached to SAIIA. So, Richard, I don't want to spend too much time introducing. We'd rather spend it talking about your work. You've produced a study called the Under Duress, Journalism in Authoritarian Context. And I want to say, as soon as the advert went out for this particular webinar, someone was on there going, well, that's not just Africa anymore, is it? So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I wonder if we could start off by you telling us a little bit more about the study and perhaps more about your work in general, which focuses on journalism safety generally.
Yeah, no, and thanks very much for having me. It's cold outside, but it's delightful to be here. So I'm at the University of Liverpool. My areas of interest are probably more like the pointy end of press freedom and media intimidation. So I do a lot of work on media and war. Broadly construed, so questions of sort of ethics of war reporting, ethics of witnessing, journalist bodies and emotions, and how people stay safe in places like, so for example, my PhD research was in South Sudan. Like, why would anyone do this sort of work? How do people keep safe? But in obvious ways, those sorts of interests, shade very quickly into the experiences of journalists in authoritarian countries. So you don't need to be at a country in war. I mean, as I'm guessing 90% of the people listening to this know, for journalism to be targeted. And so that's kind of my background. I'm in South Africa. My SAIIA project is actually more narrowly focused on community journalism, but there was an opportunity that came up with some funding that we could do a roundtable event where we basically got 17 journalists from 7 of the countries in Africa, mostly sort of East Africa, Anglophone Africa, that had some of the most atrocious press freedom records. And the idea was to sort of bring all these journalists together with some civil society and academic folk who are interested in journalistic intimidation, press freedom, to have a closed roundtable discussion just around the kinds of the challenges they face, how people sort of deal with these challenges, if they can deal with these challenges. And the idea behind all of this really was partly to get a sense of how much of the experience of being a journalist in country A versus B versus C is unique to that country's specific context, and how much of what these journalists are dealing with it actually is the same sort of thing, just dressed up in like different kind of legal states, whatever baggage. And so that was the idea, and sort of bringing them into kind of really just affording them a space to have a very, very frank conversation with colleagues about the things that kind of are on their mind most, their challenges in their job.
So I forgot, and thank you for that, but I forgot to say that my name is Dinesh, and so thank you to everyone for joining in. We'll take some questions at the end of the hour, so if you don't mind making a note of them, so as we go along. Excuse me. It is dry in Johannesburg. So you and your team were quite intentional in how you structured this intervention and this discussion with the people that you brought together. Just tell us a little bit about that and around the safety concerns that you were aware of and how you dealt with those.
Yeah, so it became quite clear quite early on that some of the places we were looking at inviting journalists from were the kind of places where there were non-trivial risks from, among other things, sort of state security, police, those sorts of people. I tend to be sometimes quite glib about it. There are countries where states like to persecute journalists, but actual state intelligence is quite chaotic. And then there are other countries that like persecuting journalists, and their state intelligence is actually very, very, very good at doing that job. And so the last thing we wanted to do was bring together journalists to talk about something that would get them in trouble, either trying to leave their country to attend or returning. And so from the beginning, the sort of date and location of the event was not made public. The only people who knew that were the people who were invited to take part. The guest lists, for example, the people we invited, we started by talking to researchers and journalists that we trusted to make informed decisions to say, look, can you recommend people that we could talk to who would be good to talk about this kind of topic, whose experiences would lend themselves to this discussion, but also to make sure, and it sounds paranoid, but to make sure these are not people who are state media aligned, because there are again, country contexts where you could invite someone who looked like a journalist who's in fact going to go back home and tell maybe people you don't want to know half of who was there and what was spoken about. So it was a very trusted network that we used to nominate people. We did sort of background checks to the best of our abilities, and even the people attending themselves didn't know who else was going to be attending until about 2 or 3 days before the event itself. And then out of the event, so the report that we produced, those who've downloaded it will notice that there are no photographs in the report. It's all, I think, very tastefully done drawings. And that's not just AI and stock art for the cynics out there. That is, we actually had a sketch artist in the room who was sketching through some of the themes that people were talking about as they were talking about them. And the whole idea was really built in that if you were taking part in this event, unless you choose to tell someone that you were taking part in it, no one would know that you took part. And that the insights that are in that report, so the event itself was conducted according to something like a sort of variation on a Chatham House rule, where there's a summary of the event, summarizing what people spoke about, some of the major themes that came out of the conversations, but nothing is attributed to anyone, and there's no record of kind of who took part in the event. And this was, at the time, we thought we were being overly paranoid, well, I thought we were being overly paranoid, and it always sort of said that thing about, it's paranoid to think the state's out to get you unless the state's out to get you. And we did have, in fact, at least one case where a journalist on departure from their country was held by the intelligence services for an hour and interrogated on why they were leaving, where they were going, what they were doing. And I think, that validated a lot of what seemed like paranoia at the time. It was like, there are, for many journalists, this is not the case, but for a handful of the participants, it very much was. There were very real risks.
Thank you for that, Richard. Let me ask you what may be an uncomfortable question about your positionality and your demographic, for example, in facilitating a conversation amongst colleagues or journalists who may not look like you, who operate in very different circumstances to you, whose lives and everyday lives are very different to yours. What was your thinking in terms of how you facilitated the workshop to make sure that you accounted for those kinds of things?
I mean, the first most obvious thing I'd probably mention is that I kind of just get out of the way. So and to be fair, most of the other academics and civil society folk in the room actually spoke very little, if at all, through the period of the event. Our role was really to just be listeners into a conversation amongst people who, you're right, whose world is intensely more dangerous and complicated and different to something that kind of I would know. So the way that the sessions worked is we had a series of sort of 4 mini conversations around different topics, each of which became one of the themes in the report. And those were chaired either by kind of journalists from the group that we'd invited or sort of select people we'd invited who sort of knew something about that kind of domain. So where we had a discussion around, for example, the relationship between editors and journalists. We had someone come in who was an editor who'd worked with some of the journalists in the room, in fact. And so we were quite conscious to make sure the people who led the discussion were people whose sort of lives and experiences are actually part of that world. And there was no real, other than sort of broad, it might be useful to have a discussion about editors and journalists. Beyond that, those chairs could take the discussion in whichever direction they felt most useful. And I think that was useful because in some cases, yes, what people talked about was the same sort of things that would be familiar to scholars of journalism and intimidation. But there were periods where people would take the conversation in kind of very different directions that, like, were I chairing, would not be things I would think of asking or talking about in like 1,000 million years. So I think, the biggest, most obvious answer to this was just getting out of the way, saying it's not, other than trying to bring people together for a discussion, where that discussion goes, what is salient, what people want to talk about is really not for me to decide. That's kind of for these people to bring the things they think are the things they want to discuss.
Thanks. And so what were one of those things that surprised you?
For me, probably the biggest single takeaway, do you read the report? I'm going to punt it. Like, I think I like it. I'm biased, but I think for me, one of the biggest things was the degree to which journalism safety wasn't just a matter of black letter law and policy. So there tends to be a lot of, sometimes discussions at like the policy level or kind of UNESCO press freedom level around, do the laws and policies in your country protect journalists? Do you have like an independent ombud for the press? It is sort of a kind of set of laws and policies that are meant to be in place. And then the more you have of these, the freer your press is, the fewer of these you have, the less free your press is. What became clear very, very quickly was firstly just how divergent actually media safety was from black letter law. So there were countries, I can talk about this because it wasn't part of the event, it was my PhD research, South Sudan, where if you looked at the media laws for South Sudan, on paper, they are intensely progressive. They are in independent media. It's like they tick all the right boxes because, as I recall, that legislation was largely sponsored by sort of Scandinavian donors with that idea of press freedom in mind. So it looks, 1,000 miles in the air on paper, it looks like a great setup. In practice, if you're a journalist, those laws have zero traction. They're not the way police actually police journalists. They're not the way the state actually behaves around journalists. And that was something that popped up routinely amongst the conversations journalists were having was, yes, my country has great laws in principle, but the police will arrest you on laws that don't exist, because the point is to arrest you. It's not about due process. Due process is to keep the laws are to keep the policymakers off our back. How we actually police journalists is different. And so that distinction between law and practical safety of journalists was interesting. And within that, how in a lot of these societies, there's this theme that kept coming back, that the safety of journalists depended less on the sort of black letter law and a lot more on something like almost social ties, or the sort of acceptance of journalism amongst civil society, its place in, how the country imagined it. So countries that journalists were demonized as peddlers of fake news, as unpatriotic, as national security threats, where those sort of narratives took root, journalists would often find themselves very, very isolated. Whatever the actual laws of the country are, you would be cut off, isolated. There'd be fewer people who would come to your aid if you were in trouble. It would be easier for the state to kind of target you. And that those countries, you tended to see exactly that, so journalists being kind of exiled, imprisoned, murdered. It was the places where relationships with civil society, or kind of the society more broadly, were much stronger, that journalists tended to be safer. And the way this seemed to work in the discussions was that in countries where civil society is willing to come to bat for journalists, is willing to stand up or take action for journalists, where it raises the sort of social costs to persecuting a journalist, right? So a good example of this as a counterfactual is somewhere like South Africa. So South Africa for me is an interesting case because relative to the kinds of corruption that journalists in South Africa often uncover and the sorts of work that they do, journalists in South Africa are actually, an interviewer once told me that the word they use is protected game. Yes, the state will mess with some journalists' affairs, like we do have intimidations, it's not perfect, but we don't summarily shoot journalists because they're doing investigations. So that the kinds of things that journalists investigate here would in many of these other countries have long ago had them imprisoned or shot. And part of the speculation here is that protection comes perhaps out of journalism's place in South Africa's history. So it's a thing that civil society does back quite strongly. There would be public kind of social consequences to going after journalists. And so, I don't want to belabor the point too long, but this was interesting to me, is how journalism safety substantially seems to depend on something like journalism's acceptance in society and its relationships with civil society and other actors, and a lot less on the things policymakers often focus on, sort of like specific laws, policies, due process, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but it does speak to the kind of linking of arms and the collaborative efforts that need to happen in order to sustain both civil society and journalism as such. I want to go back to the law aspect, because you were talking just generally just now about how, in certain countries the laws exist. They may not be actively advanced or used or applied. But you also talk about the weaponization of other laws, right? And other things that are happening. We see that even in South Africa, where we've got ongoing slap suits, we've got gag orders, and this kind of perversion of legal process, actually, to suppress media in some respects. So I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about that and what the research found in that regard.
Yeah, and all of these things you mentioned, slap suits, defamation, these are all tools that are across basically every jurisdiction that it's capable of people bringing those kinds of lawsuits. They're being used. And particularly things like slap suits seem to be a weapon of choice in many cases, less for governments and more for large, because it's often easy to fall into this trap of we're talking about journalists holding governments to account. It's more sophisticated than that. It's journalists holding, for example, large corporations, elite individuals to account. And for those individuals who may not always have access to kind of using the police to beat on a journalist, the law can often be a very, very powerful weapon. So absolutely, things like slap suits, just spurious litigation, these sorts of things were a major, major headache. And I think it speaks to, although the journalists who came to the roundtable were African journalists, these are not particularly African problems or even global South problems. So there was a time, I am skeptical it actually ever existed, but people would at least make noises around, journalism in the global South, its struggles are different to journalism in the North. And when we're talking about things like slap suits, increasingly when we're talking about things like laws around national security, classification of intelligence, these sorts of things, these are not weapons that are specific to going after journalists in the global South or periphery of the world. They are, look at America. These are increasingly just ways that the world in general is trying to, governments that want to go after journalists are using to go after journalists. And it's the law stuff can be hard because in a lot of these cases, the surface readings of a lot of these things do look like they're, of course you would want a law like this. This seems reasonable. So I think Tanzania is an example, again, not from the conference, just in general, about how you have laws that look like they are anti-fake news, anti-defamation. Like, and on the surface, these sound like perfectly reasonable things. Yes, of course you don't want to peddle fake news. Of course we should maybe have a way of weeding this out. And then you look at how those laws are actually operationalized, and it's more as a weapon, or as a potential weapon, right? So many of these laws don't even need to be used. And people would talk about this, the idea of like slap suits, or being sued. You're having your publication sued for a report. You don't have to actually be sued for the law to have force on you, right? So the idea that you might be sued conditions the way you work, adds extra layers of time and expense to investigations, all of this other stuff. So laws create, I think, environments, independently of whether they're actually used, and those environments constrain the kind of freedom of journalists to do the work that they're doing.
Yeah. And you've just mentioned something that's really critical, which I think is worth repeating. There's this perception that it's journalism versus governments, and that's really not the case. And we see it now. We're starting to see it pick up in South Africa, where reporting is around the election period and the pre-election period, and so there's this kind of heated discussion on social media, in particular, about journalists, their credibility, and their attacks on politicians, and so on and so, or perceived attacks on politicians. Very little of that discussion moves into the space of, the private sphere. It doesn't speak about the corporations and the large amounts of money and so on and so forth. And people don't get worked up by that. So there seems to be a little bit of work that needs to be done in that area. I want to move to a question that sees South Africa in the last couple of weeks around journalists, PR, strategic communications, and so on and so forth. A bit of a hot topic at the moment in the country, with several individuals involved in these debates. Tell us what the feeling was in the room in terms of journalists moving into the space. Most of them doing it mostly to sustain their families, right? To put food on the table at the end of the day. Well, many of them doing it. But what was the kind of sentiment expressed by the individuals that you were speaking to?
So it wasn't a central theme, but there was definitely a kind of background feeling that would be familiar to many journalists, this divide between journalism and PR, and there was a sense that this was a threat, and it was relative to some of the other threats, not the major threat, but there was, I don't know, a tension or something, and part of this, I think, the way to explain it is that journalism in a lot of these countries, in a lot of countries around the world at the moment, economically is suffering. So the foundations of being able to, the idea that you could become a journalist, live a long and kind of reasonably well-paid life as a journalist, and then retire as an old journalist with a pension, your face tells me everything, right? So this is a dead dream, right? And I think and journalists know this, right? Everyone in the room knew this. Every kind of cub journalist, if they didn't know this, they discover it quite quickly. There isn't a kind of long-term professional career future in being a journalist. And this is where the problem comes in, because the places where there are, if you are a communications professional, if you're good at your job, the places where there are long-term, like reasonably well-paid, like lifelong career type options tend to be places like PR or in a lot of places like government communications. And so this creates a problem, because it's not unusual then to see junior journalists, their sort of long game professionally is not to be journalists for their whole lives. That journalism is kind of an entry point from which you will then negotiate a crossover at some point into doing PR or like corporate comms or something like that, which will pay better. And if that's how you think of your professional life journey, it creates certain problems. And one of the problems that people did highlight was holding power to account. So if you are someone whose long game is, I'd like to be a government communications person, you're probably not well placed to be asking vicious questions of government spokesmen in conferences, right? You're in this inelegant position where you need to find a way into an industry that in some cases you're holding to account through sort of your watchdog work. So that was one of the problems. So this idea that we're losing people. We're losing people in the long term to this, and it's shaping the relationship between it's shaping how journalism can hold certain kinds of forms of power to account, because many journalists ultimately want to see jobs in that world. It also creates this problem of, I hate the brown envelope language because I feel like it carries a very specific sort of colonial baggage I very much dislike. But there was a lot of mention of this. So like in newsrooms, and this isn't necessarily always a failing of kind of journalist personal ethics, newsrooms that are struggling in general, in some places, will be more amenable to something that looks like, call it advertorial, call it a brown envelope. This kind of shades one into another, but the sort of accepting content from those sorts of like corporate comms or governments, communications entities, to run certain kinds of material. And there's versions of this that look more ethical than others, but the basic problem is that the journalism's need to make money to keep going creates opportunity for others who have that money and need things communicated to take advantage of it.
I think another thing that you point to in the report, which surprised me, was the concept of trust within the newsroom and between editors and journalists in particular. I didn't expect that, but if you could just tell us a little more.
Yeah, that was an example of, so when someone had suggested having this as one of the conversation topics, I was like, sure, but I don't really understand how much we could get out of talking about that. And it was actually really, really interesting. And yeah, so it was the people who attended weren't just journalists. We had editors from a number of newsrooms talking as well. And that was a conversation between the editors as to like how, particularly watchdog or investigative reporting, how that looks as an editor versus, and the journalists would talk about how it looked as a journalist and some of the tensions between the two. I mean, there's a few things that bear mentioning. So, I mean, one of these obviously was kind of questions around safety. So editors often felt drawn into needing to look after the safety of journalists, where journalists would want to sometimes, especially with investigations, kind of push to get a good story or get some sort of piece of evidence they needed. And editors had to fight or kind of grapple with this instinct for keeping their journalists safe. And this, from the editor's point of view, this seemed entirely reasonable, but sometimes this would be interpreted by journalists as, oh, you're being too conservative, or you're holding me back from to do. This should be my decision as to whether it's today or not. So there was this tension around kind of safety, for example. There was also kind of, what was quite interesting is, again, this problem of where media's struggling for money, right? So newsroom's profitability is like a major concern, is often an existential concern. Editors would say, if I'm an editor and I'm working in a newsroom, and I know because I'm an editor that, something about the finances of my newsroom, I am aware of the kinds of stories we run and what that might do to our kind of profitability, or where we're deeply dependent on certain sorts of advertisers, like, for example, state advertising. I have to think about the economic consequences of the reporting we're doing because I worry about the continued existence of my newsroom. So this idea that there was, the kind of old school idea of a firewall between the side that does sales and the economic stuff and the editorial news bit was fraying in a lot of the smaller newsrooms, because editors felt like decisions they would make over accountability reporting could have very real economic effects that could cost jobs. And so they felt themselves increasingly needing to take the economics into account. And they didn't like this because they felt like it eroded the sort of firewall that should exist between, stories should be decided on based on their news value. But the fact that their newsrooms were financially, relative degrees of desperate meant that they had to pay attention to the economics. And then the last thing I'd add is back again to slap suits and litigations, is that as that stuff gets used more and more as a way of kind of corralling the media or keeping reporting in line, editors become deeply aware when running stories of what the legal consequences of this might be, right? So are we opening ourselves up to, if not a legitimate, it's not about sometimes whether there's legitimate grounds to be sued. It's just like, could someone plausibly use this as an excuse to tie us up in litigation? And so editors were having to spend a lot more time with investigative stories, demanding kind of very high standards of evidence and proof from journalists. You'd have to go through rounds of kind of having lawyers reading the material. And all of this would sometimes get perceived by the journalists as editors being kind of conservative or reluctant to run, like they were shying away from running hard-hitting stories. And from the editor's point of view, they were like, they desperately wanted the good reporting to be done, but they had these other considerations around sort of how do we make this stuff, solid against not just actual lawsuits, but like the kinds of things we would imagine one might bring to bear against our newsroom. And again, editors didn't like this because it put them in this situation where they would need to be continually like putting the brakes on their reporters or kind of sending them back for more information. And they felt that sometimes this wasn't, they would like to be more helpful to the investigations that were happening, but they were caught up in, I can only trust my journalists so much. Like I want to trust the investigative journalists know what they're doing, but legal is not going to allow that. And so they're the people who have to kind of, what's the word, like arbitrage, like manage this tension between what the journalists want to do and the kind of degree to which they want to push the claims in their stories, and the sort of legal and economic environment that the newsroom actually exists in.
So I think it's so interesting that you say that, because often when I speak to African journalists who are trying to kind of make a breakthrough in publishing abroad, and abroad I mean the global north, they often hear from those publications that their stories aren't legally defensible, or the standard of evidence is not as high as they would consider it, but it really is. And it's unclear as to what is required then to make that kind of breakthrough. Now, you do talk about this lack of accessibility to the media abroad. I wonder if you just could explain a little bit of the kinds of issues that came up.
It definitely popped up in the editors journalist discussion as well, because there was this feeling that, especially when you have a situation of foreign editor hiring African journalists to work in their particular country, they would often point to, so there are a couple of problems. One of these is that often editors abroad just would have no real concept of what the danger of working in certain situations are like, or that certain kinds of stories might be fault lines. So they might ask a journalist, or insist that a journalist file a story on something that seems like a relatively innocuous political, whatever, cultural matter, and the journalist would try to explain, no, you can't do this because it will touch certain sorts of interests, and these interests are the kinds of people who would cause trouble. And editors often just wouldn't or couldn't grasp that, right? The danger of what they were actually asking journalists to do, and the nature of that relationship. The power didn't really sit, generally speaking, with the journalist in the field. So the ability to negotiate your editor into understanding the specifics of doing some sort of reporting story in country X. Generally speaking, editors are not interested in learning the specifics of the safety situation in different countries. So that was kind of one of the problems. The other was kind of conversely. So editors who were trying to keep local teams safe, one of the ways they would do this is just removing their bylines. So they'd have reporting from some other country, and you would just carry the byline of our correspondent or the newspaper itself. And journalists, they were sympathetic to why one might do this. So it meant that they were not traceable, couldn't be kind of tracked down and harmed. But then they pointed out this, again, this is a sort of decolonial critique of where the profits of news work flow, right? So when you are not credited in a byline, that means that in at least one or two cases, people in the room were aggrieved that the stories they'd worked on had won awards, and they had not shared in the prize money of those awards, they had not shared in the professional status of those awards. And when they had complained about this, they were told, no, we're doing this to keep you safe, which is sort of, at the one hand, well-meaning, but also incredibly paternalistic and convenient when the person who's keeping you safe gets to reap all of the sort of professional and financial rewards for your work. And so this was kind of considered a hard problem. It's how do you, to the first question, how do you get editors from the global north to care about the specifics of security situations where they're soliciting material from? But also, how do you balance this question of what do we do to keep you safe while still allowing you to sort of take credit for the work that you're doing, where that credit might put you in danger?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. There were a couple of women in the room. I wonder if you could just explore a little bit of the kind of different things that came up from them that didn't occur amongst the men.
There were many women in the room. So we went out, this is one of the things we went out of our way to do is, again, journalism often is imagined as a particularly masculine endeavor, and this is in fact not true in the slightest. And so what was interesting amongst the women participants was sort of universally, there were no exceptions to this. There was this consensus that newsrooms are particularly patriarchal, kind of hypermasculine environments that were often quite difficult to work in. So it was an interesting sort of side debate on this at one point as to whether, so based on the consensus that many, to differing degrees, newsrooms were often kind of very patriarchal environments, was this because news work as it had been, the normative idea of journalism in the newsroom that came from the West was just a sort of masculine adventurer, boys club kind of vibe, and that had somehow been that culture had been imported? Or was it the case that in some of these countries, culture generally was highly patriarchal? So people shouldn't be surprised when you have a professional environment of any kind in certain countries that would be a patriarchal environment. I think by the end of that discussion, people had settled into why not both? Why can't you just import a set of patriarchal norms from a practice in the West into an environment that is already patriarchal, and you end up with a kind of often quite toxic work environment? The kind of practical implications of this is, I think there's at least two things here. So the one is that it meant that for a lot of women journalists, newsrooms were not the safe refuges that they were for male colleagues. So when male colleagues would suffer targeting, abuse, pressure, stress, all of the sort of stuff that was common to everyone, they in many cases could come back to the newsroom, and the newsroom was a sort of safe social space where people were kind of attentive to your needs and kind of looked after you, or provided a kind of an escape. For many women, that wasn't the case. You couldn't go, like, your newsroom was not the place that you could go back and be vulnerable, because you needed to keep up certain sorts of appearances. There's certain sorts of things you can and can't talk about. And so that was interesting, because it suggests that, this idea of newsroom as a sort of safe haven it's not a safe haven for everyone. And it's, and that's divided in obvious sorts of ways. The other was just a kind of more, and this shouldn't be new for journalism studies scholars, but say, particularly thinking about safety and gender, but that the kind of safety issues faced by women journalists make them a community within a community. So there are elements of safety and journalism safety and press freedom that they share in common with male colleagues, but there are also other concerns that male colleagues just would not reflect on, or kind of would not occur to them. And as a matter of, if one is interested in press freedom, if one's interested in like journalism safety, it's unhelpful to just sort of take the male experience and say, okay, these are the things that are problems for journalists, and this is how the world looks, because in fact it looks very, very different along gender lines.
And connected to that is some of the mental health issues that you talk about. I think what was very noteworthy for me was just the role of the editor in kind of dealing with mental health within the newsroom. Yeah,
that was really, and it was interesting because editors, what you need to do to become an editor virtually never includes being attentive to the emotional. Like, it's not your ability to do sensitive, emotional, social work in a newsroom is not a formal requirement for being an editor, and yet is such an important part of the sort of like subtle work required of the job. And that this was, the journalists and editors both would talk about situations where there were editors who were just like wholly unable who didn't have the sort of empathy, emotional IQ kind of like skills to manage newsrooms well, and how badly this could work, but also editors who were sensitive and could see some of what was going on emotionally in their newsrooms, often made very, very good editors, especially for helping journalists deal with stress and trauma. And an example of this would also be in a lot of contexts, again, back to the sort of patriarchal norms, it's changing, but there's still often the sense of, not wanting to look weak, not looking like you're not coping with the emotional weight of doing a story. And so journalists would feel sometimes compelled to put on a brave face. And it was the editors who had this sort of emotional sensitivity to see through the brave face and go like, yes, I'm sure you're doing fine. I'm giving you 2 weeks or whatever. You just need to go take a break just because. Yeah. And it was editors who could kind of, but it takes a lot. It takes editors who are willing to sort of see beyond like stoic standards of newsroom work to sort of often like model good behavior for others.
Yeah, and it also speaks to a new level of care that they're not trained for, actually.
Yeah.
I had a student of mine a couple of years ago who did a study on editors and their ability to deal with mental health in newsrooms, and they themselves said, we're not capable and we don't have anyone to turn to when our mental health is affected. So it speaks to, something that's demanded of them that was never conceptualized early on. I'm going to stop there for a second and just ask if there are any questions from anyone else, and then I'll continue. Hands up if you have a question. I see one of our PhD students, Caroline.
Yes.
Hi. Do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I'm not a PhD student. I'm heading a media development organization called Fondation Hirondelle. We are based in Switzerland, and we work in fragile contexts, and in Africa, mainly the Sahel and the Great Lakes region. My question is, what we observe because of the political pressure, the shrinking space, the funding situation is journalists that actually don't have media to work in. I'm thinking of the Sahel, where many media have been closed by governments and the military regimes. What is your take on that trend? And the fact that we talk more and more about content producers versus journalists, is this something that you discussed with the journalists in your roundtables? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rich.
So we didn't discuss this in the roundtable explicitly. It is something I have capital T thoughts on, though. I think the idea that there aren't outlets that people can work in, I think is a flavor of a broader problem, that it's increasingly hard to make a career out of being a journalist, to earn a sort of a regular salary that you can pay your expenses and live a life through. My view on this is, I think, and this is perhaps slightly controversial, there's an excellent paper by Marcel Brusma and I forget his co-author. They're from the University of Groningen, and they make this idea that journalism studies, and journalism particularly, has this problem where it imagines journalism as being a newsroom something around the late 80s, early 90s, and all of journalism and journalism policy is disproportionately focused on how do we get that back? How do we find a model for the media or a business model that will allow us to have a newsroom like they had in, All the President's Men? And they argued that this is gone. Like, there is never going. That was a unique kind of situation. There was no internet. Like, it was a social, cultural, economic kind of stuff came together to make that a possible business. We are never getting back to a world where that will exist again, outside of like a few places. And so for them, and I think I agree with this, is that increasingly journalism is going to become kind of a thing one does rather than a well-remunerated professional career. Like, there might still be large journalists working for large news organizations, but I think, for me, I think the future of journalism probably looks a lot more like the gentleman scientist of the Victorian era, where you see people whose actual main source of income is something else, IT, legal, some other professional activity, and journalism is a thing that they sort of do on the side out of a sort of civic duty. They think this is important. I think you see examples of this in South Africa. So I think like Daniel Knutzer, for example, is someone who's done a lot of investigative work on IPID, like the police misbehavior investigations unit. Here's, as I understand, like his main gig is not investigative journalism. He has other things that he does that pay the bills, and does journalism using those skills out of an intense sense of justice. And this is the thing that should be done. And I think the future of journalism may look like this. It may look like gig work where people are sort of doing journalism, but where their sort of primary source of income is somewhere else. Is this a good thing? I think that's a complicated question. I mean, it depends partly, what your something else is. It also means where journalists are working in this sort of like individual dipping in, dipping out capacity, it becomes much harder to have conversations around media or press freedom, right? So when is someone a journalist? How should we protect people who are kind of dipping in and dipping out of an occupation like this? I think it provokes a lot of hard questions, but I think for me that trend that newsrooms are shrinking, that the careers in journalism are becoming more and more unstable, I sound like such a doomer, but I think is inevitable. And so the question is, if we think this labor of holding power to account and telling true stories is important, who will be doing it? Because people will pick it up. And how do we... What you're seeing is absolutely a very real trend, and I don't see it reversing anytime soon. In the African context, particularly with some of the countries you're talking about, and I love the work of Van Dessen Hirondell, like the USAID cuts just kneecapped a whole bunch of news organizations who were either depending on that money directly for funding their operations. So Internews, for example, their staff was halved when USAID folded, but also news organizations who were dependent on advertising or kind of money from an ecosystem of humanitarians and civil society who themselves were being funded by USAID. When USAID collapsed, that whole ecosystem just lost money. So I think it's going to get worse. Sorry.
Yeah, it's never a positive discussion to have. There was a second part of the question about media operating in spaces or not being able to operate in spaces like certain countries in the Sahel. Are you able to speak to that one?
Not operating in terms of like press safety or the economics of it?
Yeah, not operating because of press safety.
I mean, I've seen ways people have negotiated this in the past. So I mean, the example, as much as it's, I was poo-pooing it earlier, of international publications keeping bylines hidden. This is one way that people are able to sort of operate. Mm-hmm. I've seen very interesting practices in again, this is like back to South Sudan some years back, where journalists would have stories or would be aware of things that they know can prove but cannot possibly publish, because if you publish that, the kind of the consequences of that would be you have no good defense against them. One of the interesting strategies there is journalists would pass that material on to other publications or other journalists outside the country. They would publish this material. And then once the thing was a sort of open secret, then you could republish inside your country saying, oh, look, the international press has broken the story. We're just republishing it. And that would often take some of the sting out of this. There are other kind of talk a little bit about practices. I mean, some of the interesting things that the journalists do in some of these contexts seem a little bit counterintuitive. So in a few cases, journalists would talk about having really, really close relationships with the police and security services in their country. And being naive, had always assumed if these are the people who are putting you in jail or beating you or persecuting you, you would want to stay as far away from them as possible. And in fact, it was the opposite. So journalists would talk about having really good relationships with the security apparatus in general often meant that you would get a heads up or you would get a warning if something was coming your way. People would, you had friends that could get you out of tight places in a way that if you kind of kept away from the security services, they would be less helpful to you. There was a case of a journalist where the state wanted to seize his house, and he got a heads up a couple of months ahead of it from someone in the police office who had been tasked with kind of processing the seizure, saying, look, this is what's coming down the line. You have about 2 months. Try and sell your house as fast as you can, so it's possible to do. And that was really interesting because as much as we point to like, oh, big bad states, getting their big bad security apparatus to persecute journalists, states or kind of elites who want to use security personnel to punish journalists, those security personnel have consciences of their own. They have beliefs about the place of journalism in society, the virtue of reporters. And so having good relationships with those people would often would thwart the ambitions of people who would like to use policemen or the army or whatever to go after journalists.
Mm-hmm. And this is where, exile and refugee media becomes so critical, but also collaborations with those civil society organizations that we were talking about earlier in order to get information to move across borders, as it were. Caroline, thank you for that question or those questions. SAIIA Claudius, your hand is up. SAIIA, you can go.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Hi, so my name is SAIIA Tladi, and I'm a PhD student in communication studies at the University of Johannesburg. My question is around international media and particularly international state media, and the editorial controls that international state media brings when they do come to African countries. I mean, in my experience working in journalism, and perhaps I don't want to share too deeply, but I've seen a lot of editorial control in a way that makes me feel as though there are some of the international media organizations that are interested in maintaining the status quo, rather than challenging it in any way. So I just wanted to know if any of the other African journalists had a sort of experience like that, or their experiences with working with state media, and particularly international state media. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a really good question. So, I mean, in terms of journalists working with state media in their own countries, basically none of those people were at the roundtable because we were too twitchy about having people who work for state media in a room with people who are trying to investigate states. You're absolutely right, though, that this is a constraint more broadly. So working with sort of international state media. This isn't from this workshop, but again, I know South Sudan and kind of Kenya as examples where journalists reporting for, I think it's CCTV or CGTN, have in the past spoken about how there's certain sorts of stories you don't pitch them, and generally speaking, around human rights stories are not, they don't sell, so you just don't do human rights stories for those publications. And this is it's a kind of insidious control because it doesn't look like what it is, right? So it's not oh, you published a thing and we're punishing you for it. It's just the economics of the setup are such that we're just not going to buy certain sorts of stories, or we're not going to pay you to write certain sorts of stories. And so it's a very subtle control, right? Because it doesn't look like someone is punishing you. It's just someone is failing to reward you for writing certain angles or certain things. So I mean, I think that on one level that's a thing. So different international news organizations will have their own like angles, or like, for example, we're not doing human rights stories. I think there's also like more pernicious problems around the economics of particularly like crisis and conflict reporting, of how Sudan, for example, should be a massive news story, or like northern Ethiopia should be a much larger news story than it is, given the number of people who've died and the destruction. And yet the international news economy, and this isn't particularly, I suppose, a problem of state news media, but just isn't interested in material from there. But yeah, so it was really just a way of, I agree with you. I think state media does come with constraints. So does private media, but state media's constraints may be sometimes constraints in a sort of, I don't know, slightly more pernicious way. But it's absolutely a problem, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you so much, SAIIA. Are there any other questions? I'm hoping we can wrap up in another 2 minutes or so if we have no questions. So, Richard, let me finish off by asking you about what you deliberately call tactics, not solutions, but tactics to kind of deal with operating in very authoritarian contexts. And that came through in your discussions with these journalists and editors. If you could tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, and yeah, the tactics language was very much trying to capture the idea that these are not going to for sure keep you safe. It's just how do you do your best to make the most of the situation that you're in. I mentioned the one, so this idea of close relationships with police and security forces in some cases. Again, not from the workshop, but as an anecdote that illustrates this. I mean, again, a few years back, working in South Sudan, talking to an investigative journalist who do a lot of work on like government and sort of oil contracts. He would keep a literal pocketbook of people that he knew in the army and the military with their WhatsApps and their rank. So he had like, I have 2 generals, I have a colonel, I have 5 sergeants, and this. And if he got in trouble with the police, what he would do is he would use his notebook. And if you had arrested me and you were a sergeant, I would find the lowest ranking person in my book who was higher ranked than you, right? Because I don't want to burn a general to get out of trouble with a captain or so on. And that was how he did things. So he had favors he could call in from people, and he would use those favors to get released 5 or 6 times this sort of way. And I always found that a really interesting way of approach. It was a very logical, like rational system. But underlying it was this idea that it's very helpful to have relationships with the people who might be asked to kind of come after you because they could help you in different ways. They're not always invested in punishing people, always they're people too. The other was sort of what was interesting is for a lot of journalists, and particularly to Caroline's question, ones who were operating more kind of independently, because they would be especially in danger if you were sort of a content creator and you were out covering a protest. Like, what keeps you safe if you don't necessarily have a newsroom to back you up? And one of the things that was interesting there is they would talk about sort of being known, so being a sort of a person that would be like a recognized personality could keep you safe in some situations. So if we target this person, it will create news in a way that would be unhelpful. This cuts both ways. Sometimes I want to go after you to make an example of you, but all else being equal, if I could, chase this person, or I could chase the famous YouTuber, I'm probably not going to chase the famous YouTuber because I would look bad. But also and related to that, they would talk about sometimes, particularly covering like protests or live events or things where security forces were active. Being live was a form of being safe. So where people were streaming live and where security forces or others in like protests knew that you were streaming live, that could sometimes be a slight deterrent, right? So this idea that there's no way for me to go after you that won't be seen. And this was the kind of comment in that the idea that you might be seen raises the costs of going after you compared to sort of other people in the situation. And that was kind of interesting, and it was, and I think generalizes to a degree, is that part of what seems to keep media safe is precisely the profile of media. So it's the more your media house is known, the more your journalists are familiar to people, that potentially raises the costs for a state or a company or whoever to go after you or to sue you or to imprison you or do whatever, because it will be news, or it will kind of make a splash in a way that might just be counterproductive to your efforts. Particularly, again, it's like investigations. If you're being investigated, going after the person investigating you might just blow up the story to an even bigger extent and bring consequences that you don't like. So being live and being known kind of created this cost to going after journalists. And then the last thing was really just back to this idea of networks. So journalists would talk about just having good relationships with civil society, with lawyers, with kind of people in general, so that when you are targeted or when people go after you, there are people in society who will come to your aid. So South Africa, we're perhaps better off than this in this respect than most. There's, if someone goes after, I don't know, Daily Maverick or Mail and Guardian, like there are people who would push back. There's like elements of civil society that would come to their aid, and it's in the countries and situations where journalism is alienated from civil society, where you're at more risk because people can come after you and people are too afraid to stand up or are unwilling to kind of stand and deal with you. One organization specifically that kept coming up in Southern Africa was MISA, the Media Institute of Southern Africa, who time and time again journalists would talk about them as being basically journalistic Batman. Like if you were in jail some part, if you could reach MISA, they would send someone, and that someone would generally be very, very helpful. And they were an interesting example of just this civil society or kind of bonds with kind of civil society actors on a not just country level, but across, you can have across a region, organizations that if it's known that, if it's kind of people are aware that they will come to your aid if you're in trouble, that could reduce some of the kind of impact of states kind of going after you. All of which is, it's tactics because it doesn't stop the broader problem of going after the press, but it does give journalists and their media houses things that they can do to sort of blunt that force when it's applied to them.
So we started off talking about the kind of generalized issues that cropped up during the course of this engagement with the journalists and the editors. But of course, Africa is not a country, right? We've got all these different countries with different contexts and different ways of operating, cultures, and so on and so forth. I think what I would ask you to end off with is this kind of caveat to how do we read this report in terms of understanding the general issues, but kind of, recognizing the different contexts and so on.
Yeah, I think the report should be read as these were things that across multiple countries at a general, like a medium level of abstraction, were common concerns, common tactics, common experiences. And necessarily the report had to be like that. I think each of the countries does have very specific nuances as to how some of these processes play out or how specifically threats in that country function. But the balance of needing to keep the countries anonymous so that people couldn't work backward to work. At some point, if you talk too specifically about strategies for evading security force or oppression in country ABC, the number of journalists working in investigative type reporting in that country is sufficiently small that it would very much help to de-identify them. So the report necessarily kept things kind of vague in general. And so what we tried to do is on those things where there was a consensus, across countries with often very different kind of historical trajectories, cultures, places of journalism, those societies. These are some of the things that they had in common and some of the strategies they adopted against. And the last thing I'd add is we tried with the report. So there are things in there if you're interested in press freedom and journalistic safety. We'd be like, yes, this is old hat. Of course, I know this. This is obvious. We've tried to focus a lot more on the things that wouldn't be obvious, right? So there's this sort of what was it that people came to as a consensus that might surprise someone who had been thinking about kind of press freedom or journalistic safety. What might be new?
Okay. Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you for your time. I know you have a big trip ahead of you, so I wish you well on that trip. For everyone on the call, thank you so much for joining us. We have shared a link in the chat to the SAIIA site where you can download the report. Please take a look and share your comments on Twitter and so on and so forth, or X as it's called nowadays. But thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Cheers, everyone.